Blog Talk Radio.
Are you ready to take a bite out of the competition? Are you looking for ideas to make your business better? Welcome to the Core Business Show with Tim Jacquet, sponsored by Apple Capital Group. At the core of every successful business, you'll find people making a difference. And with each episode of the Core Business Show, we talk with those people, examine those ideas, and explore the strategies that make them special. Now, the host of the Core Business Show, Tim Jacquet.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Core Business Show. I'm Tim Jacquet, your host. Today we're going to talk about organ building, and it's a question that keeps coming up. And we're going to talk to a founder and president of Pasi Organ Builders, who is on the West Coast, and which is in Washington, Roy, Washington. And we'll talk to Marty in a few minutes. So in the meantime, let's go and take a break from one of our sponsors, and we'll be back in a moment with the president of Pasi Organ Company. Thank you. We'll be back in a moment. Here's a word from our sponsor.
You're listening to the Core Business Show, sponsored by Apple Capital Group. Apple Capital Group in Jacksonville, Florida, is a commercial lender that specializes in asset-based loans, equipment leasing and financing, invoice financing, commercial real estate loans, and asset-based financing in the U.S. and Canada. Apple Capital Group is a direct lender that lends on their private equity investment portfolio. 90% of most loans are decided within 2 hours, and vendor funding within 24 hours after documents are completed, with a one-page application. No slow no's, just a quick decision and a fast yes. To get more information about lending from Apple Capital Group, call 866-611-7457. That's 866-611-7457 to speak with one of our loan specialists. Or visit us right now at applecapitalgroup.com. Welcome back to the Core. Once again, here's Tim Jacquet.
Well, welcome back to the Core Business Show. I'm Tim Jacquet, your host. Well, Martin, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you.
So, to begin with, kind of tell us about how you got started into organ building.
Well, my story is I grew up in Austria, in Europe, and went to a church regularly there and was a member of the boys' choir. And we were a bunch of boys around the organ a lot, and I showed special interest for the sound of the organ and always really wanted to hear the organ as much as I could. So I went to church a lot and in order to get that. And so after, when I became of age to choose a profession, I thought of that. That would be a good thing. I was always really good with my hands and also had a keen interest in music. So it seemed like it was a perfect combination to become an organ builder, and that's how I got started. I applied for an apprenticeship position there nearby where I grew up in Austria, and they took me on, and I went through a 4-year apprenticeship program with working at the shop and also a school in Germany, an organ building school near Stuttgart. And so after that, the company sent me off into the world installing organs, and came to this country, to the U.S., quite a bit over the years, and eventually stayed. And then worked with builders in Canada and the U.S. before I started my business in Roy, Washington, which is near Seattle, and about into 1990.
Wow, what an amazing journey. So before we talk about how you started your particular business, tell us about the apprenticeship program itself in the organ building.
Yeah, this in Europe, or in a lot of countries in Europe, apprenticeship programs are in place in order for kids basically to become a professional, and this is typically at the age starts typically at age 15, so it's kind of like a substitute for high school, but with this emphasis on a trade. And so there are schools for any kind of trade you can imagine, including organ building or piano making, violin making, or any other trade one could imagine. And so a school has to be provided. That's the law. And so that's how typically you start in organ building. The woodwork is a very important part of organ building. And So one learns how to make cabinets as opposed to furniture. Wood joinery, that's usually the first step. And then getting into keyboard making. I mean, you go through all the stages of an organ making, and it takes quite a bit of time, the 4 years, to get through this program. And I was fortunate to grow up in this, or apprentice with this company that had international esteem, and they delivered organs all over the world. And of course, they always need somebody to go, and I love traveling. So it was kind of a perfect setting for me. But it's always a mix of work and school, this apprenticeship program. It's, in this case, because there's only one school in the German-speaking countries of Europe, the one in Germany. Mm-hmm. One goes, works 8 months and then goes to school for 3 months in one block. Typically, apprenticeship trade schools are local, regional schools where one can just go one day a week. Mm-hmm. That's how it normally works.
Wow. So you start off with cabinet building. Are you there? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. So you start off with cabinet building, and I'm sure that is a fine art to get detail, because I'm looking at your website, and I'm looking, oh my gosh, look at all the fine detail within this cabinet. I mean, which would take hours to complete. So that alone, learning how to craft that particular detail and make things kind of individual, that's part of that whole process, why it takes so long as well.
Yes, it takes typically, an average organ takes us about a year to build, and we are five people working at our shop. And of course, what you see is sort of the small part. I mean, it looks large, but as far as hours that go of labor that go into an organ, the inside this cabinet that you see are many, hundreds of thousands of parts that all need to be made, including, of course, the pipe. The metal pipes, we cast our own metal for metal sheets that we melt the metal and pour on a table in order to get the right thicknesses and the right alloys that are not easy to buy from suppliers. Especially, we are using very special alloys that are historic examples in Europe, from organs that are up to 600 years old and still work.
So even from the mechanical component, and today I'm sure there's a lot more technology into the organ, the pipes will still be the pipes, the blowers, but when it comes to the mechanics inside the organ, what differentiates between the organ that's 600 years old to the organ of today?
Well, it depends who you talk to. I mean, my company specializes in building organs in this historic style from especially the 17th and 18th century. And those organs were still, even though 300 years ago, they were very much like the ones 600 years ago. But so what we do, we really specialize in this kind of system, in this historic style, in order to recreate the music that needs to be played, the famous composers for the organ and other instruments. So I mean, this is an important part of my style, or the style that I use in organ building. There are many other styles or later styles that introduce electricity into the playing action, like when you push a key on the keyboard, the linkage between the key and the valve that opens the wind to the pipe in my organs are entirely mechanical. So in other words, the key is suspended from this valve, and then when you push the key, you're actually physically opening this valve with your finger. And then there's this other system later on, once electricity came about over 100 years ago, that then organ builders started using electric connections between the key and the valve. And that lasted for a while, and it's actually still practiced by some companies. But there was, after the Second World War, there was this organ revival, tracker organ revival, it's called. It's a mechanical, tracker refers to mechanical key action. And that revival has been going very strong and still is. And so we come back to the past, trying to make instruments that really can produce the old music authentically, so to speak.
Okay. So the differences between the old style today, so you do a combination of the mechanical and less electricity, or is it a mostly mechanical and then electricity added?
Well, there's some, when you choose stops for an organ by pulling the stops, and that part sometimes I will use electric combination system, which allows the organist to make quick changes to certain organ literature that where that kind of thing is needed. And that usually happens from a certain size on up, and smaller organs or medium-sized organs often have all that also mechanical. So the only electricity in many of my organs is when you switch on the blower that produces the wind, that creates the wind that blows into a bellows. That's often, and it also has happened in the past that I have made organs that can play entirely without electricity, and then, of course, you needed somebody to pump the bellows, just like before electricity.
Wow. So, so you mentioned, I think, the top of the hour regarding the components. You have to make your own components, metal pipes, and also you have also during that time you had also wood pipes. I don't know if you call them pipes, but
Yeah.
oh, okay. Kind of tell us what's the differences between the metal and the wood.
Well, the wood pipes are typically made for really large stops, like the really very large pipes are often made of wood because the low frequencies, the material of the pipe is not as crucial and anymore because it's a low frequency. So it's just basically a frequency. It doesn't have much of a tone color, just a bass that's in the background. And so anyway, because very large pipes are difficult to make out of metal, because metal is not as stable as wood as far as strength in itself. And but in the past, in history, one can look at places, regions like the Alps in Austria, for example. Organ builders used more wood because wood was very available, and more in the north there was not as much wood. There was more metal used for pipes, so it had probably somewhat some practical reason too. So a wood pipe can sound very fine too, but the metal pipe is really the most typical pipe you can find in an organ. I mean, the majority out of, let's say, 3,000 pipes in one organ, there might be maybe 200 made out of wood and the rest in metal.
Okay. Certain regions of the country, like for example, Germany is and the Alps countries are higher in altitude, and versus as you go to different regions, for example, take the U.S. We're talking about extreme from one to the other. You can go to as far as Alaska to as far as Brownsville, Texas, or Miami, and wood and metal reacts differently with these wide changes. And you have one extreme here in Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, and you have the extreme of the South, dry heat, high humidity. It does those mechanical parts like wood and metal. Do they react differently in those particular climates, and you need to go towards one particular item versus the other?
Yeah, metal is not so critical. Wood, of course, is, and since the instrument is made, I would say about 70% of the material that we put into an organ is probably wood. And we use really high quality wood, vertical grain wood, where it's appropriate or desired for stability. And we do build in some kind of mechanisms that will adjust accordingly to with high differences in humidity mostly. Let's say the worst kind of area would be the Midwest, where it's cold in the winter and therefore very dry because of the heat. and then quite humid in the summer. So we need to compensate for these changes, and that happens through experience that we have collected knowledge about what to do for this sort of thing. It's critical, of course, that an instrument works at any time during the year, for mostly in churches or concert halls. And but we learned how to deal with that in order to get it reliable.
Okay, we're going to take a short break real quick, and we'll be back in a moment and talk more about organ building. Be back in about 40 seconds. We're going to take a break. Be back with the Core Business Show.
You're listening to the Core Business Show, sponsored by Apple Capital Group. Apple Capital Group in Jacksonville, Florida, is a commercial lender that specializes in asset-based loans, equipment leasing and financing, invoice financing, commercial real estate loans, and asset-based financing in the U.S. and Canada. Apple Capital Group is a direct lender that lends on their private equity investment portfolio. 90% of most loans are decided within 2 hours, and vendor funding within 24 hours after documents are completed, with a one-page application. No slow no's, just a quick decision and a fast yes. To get more information about lending from Apple Capital Group, call 866-611-7457. That's 866-611-7457 to speak with one of our loan specialists. Or visit us right now at applecapitalgroup.com. Welcome back to the Core. Once again, here's Tim Jacquet.
Our topic today is our organ building. Martin, I have a question regarding the organ building yourself. You have a lot of projects throughout the country, and most notable, I think one of your projects were in Houston. Can you talk about that process of that particular organ? And also, why you calling all your organs opus, and they about numbers, or kind of tell us?
Yes, and opus is a name that translates into original work, like a lot of composers of music have been using that term. And so if I build two organs that are identical to each other, then I do not call them, then I call them maybe opus 8, A and B, but doesn't get a separate number because it wouldn't be an original work. So each organ that we build practically is an original piece that is not, that never repeat. And in case of this Opus 19, we call it, because it's the number 19, the 19th organ that we built since we started. In that case, we were contacted by the organist and also a consultant that they hired in Houston to come and look and see what I would propose to build there. And the building was actually not even built yet when I first went there. It was just under construction for the beautiful new cathedral there. So there was a bit of a challenge, of course, because of its size. It's a huge building, and we were glad to take this project on. And it took us 3 years to build here at the shop, and then installing the organ for almost a whole year it took on site. And that organ has 5,500 pipes, and each pipe, once the physical organ is all the parts are put together, the pipes need to sound properly in that particular room. Each room has different acoustics, so one cannot prepare that kind of work at home at the shop. So each single pipe needs to be worked on, and the loudness of each pipe has to be set by letting more or less wind into the pipe. The tone color of the pipe needs to be set by influencing or working on all kinds of parts of the pipe. These pipes are made of tin and lead, and therefore are shapeable, soft metal. And so that organ, of course, has been a very important part of my career, because it was such a great opportunity to build such a good building and good musicians and a good setting. Houston has received quite a few new organs lately, so it seems like it's a really new area for organs to be built. And the cathedral organ already has, now it has been done about for 2 years, and many people in the world know that organ already. It became famous very quickly.
Wow. Tell us about that process. Uh, Mainly, it was designed for the room, but kind of walk us through a normal committee person that specialize in who's a consultant and the organist there. How you walk through that process. Only thing most people know is, hey, I want a pipe organ for our church, and then we go from there. Then we got to talk about financing and all the other things. But tell us what the makeup for the instrument itself, what they were actually looking for to achieve.
Well, this organ companies mostly work with word of mouth kind of advertising. One person talks to the next, and also the organist in a position like this would be fairly highly educated organist with even a doctorate in organ performance from reputable universities, and so that's where the first going through a school like this, the students would become familiar with organ builders and through their teachers. And in this case, the organist there, Krista Miller, she engaged Robert Bates from the University of Houston, who she studied with at one time and as a consultant. So, and he's a very internationally known organist who has a lot of knowledge about the ins and outs of organs and beyond just playing the organ. And so when typically what happens is a church or an institution will maybe invite 3 different organ builders to come and look and see what they would suggest or propose to do. And typically also the customer would have a budget, and then we would have to work within that budget and propose an instrument. And the proposal is usually, of course, not only an organ builder's job. It's in conjunction with the musician of the church and also with the consultant together create a stop list, which is a stop list is like a specification of sound. It's almost like an orchestra that would have violin, first violin, second, third, and so on through all the instruments. And a small orchestra, a chamber orchestra would be small, and a big symphonic orchestra for romantic music or modern music, it would be large. And it's sort of the same there are parallels between that and an organ. So figure out a stop list first, and then comes a visual design for an organ case that would fit into the building properly. And sometimes architects come into that picture, into that process. And in this case, I have worked with the architects there in Houston fairly closely and went back and forth with design issues and came up with what you can see now in the end. And it's a fairly long process, this whole thing, because it's such a huge undertaking, it takes such careful consideration, because it really is something for the future that we make that can last literally hundreds of years.
Wow.
That's what we hope for. Yeah.
And that's kind of mostly atypical, but a typical parish that want to look for an organ, what things they really need to look at if they're looking at a pipe organ? There's a difference between, I guess, the U.S. and Europe, but kind of tell us what they really need to be thinking about as they're looking at building, considering a pipe organ for the church.
Well, the most important thing, I think, in my opinion, is that one should strive for the highest quality of building material and process, and that often means that an instrument might be a little smaller than what the customer was hoping for, but small, of course, can be beautiful, and that's what I usually try to preach when I'm asked for that kind of opinion. And then, of course, a big decision is whether it's going to be a mechanical action instrument or electric action instrument. But that's what I find, and my colleagues that build in this sort of style also, is that customers typically already know what they want to begin with, as far as the big differences between electric and mechanical, and also stylistic. many different styles of organ sound, and especially the German sound and the French sound. Those are the two main sound styles that exist, and that has something to do with the literature that's being played mostly or has been composed. So churches, what's the best to do, of course, is hiring a consultant if that's needed, and the consultant would be able to guide people through the process and also suggest, let's say, 2 or 3 organ builders that would be suitable for this kind of project that they're desiring to get. And there are so many different ways of doing it. It's hard to say really what's the proper way or what's the most common way to do it. I find myself in many different situations each time. Some customers will go and study someone's organs and travel around the country and look and talk to previous customers or the owners of those organs, and then come to a conclusion and say, no, this is maybe not what we want, or this other one, that's really what we want, we like this. And then I get invited, and the bidding or the proposal process starts. This discussion, what would be best to do, and of course the budget, trying to figure out what that would be or what they can afford. And that's pretty much how it works.
So when it comes to the German, the French, and the British sound, U.S. is kind of a hodgepodge, because we have some traditional churches that's really traditional, but then we have a different level of the game than versus Europeans. They have really been doing this type of music for 600 years. We're new to this. Maybe I think some of the other churches only 200 years old, and they're so diverse. They're trying to be everything across the board. And as we grow, we become more sophisticated and say, hey, yeah, we want to do a pipe organ. What is the differences between the British sound, the French, and the German?
Well, the German sound this is a very rough kind of way of saying it, but the German sound is, let's say, more of a Lutheran sound, which is really based on hymn singing, accompanying or helping the congregation to support with the hymns. So therefore, the sound structure of that kind of an organ is made to do that particular thing really well. And of course, there's also lots and lots of literature written over the years, hundreds of years, for the organ in Germany. And then in France, in the more Catholic countries, an organ looked a little different. It had not an accompanying function, but an alternating function. It was like between chant and organ. It went back and forth. So the organ was not played with people singing at the same time. And so it has quite a bit of a different sound. Plus, of course, the buildings in France were very, very large and needed lots of power as far as the reed stops, trumpet and trombone, such. And the British, I'm not as familiar with the British sound, but that's very, the way we think of British organs is like an accompanying a big choir. Choir music is very important in England, and therefore those organs are very expressive as far as loudness up and down, like having swell divisions that can swell the sound up and down, loud and soft, and to go along with the dynamics of the music that is sung by the choir. So in this country, of course, we want all of those things. So, and in a case like the Houston organ that I built, the big one, cathedral, it's so large that is possible to combine different styles into one organ, and that's only possible because of its size. That's wonderful when that happens, or when it can happen, but of course many churches are not that large and maybe don't have that kind of budget, and then I would rather concentrate on one style rather than mixing styles, and that's usually just a more successful musical instrument in the end.
Okay. Talking about financing, well, let's talk about the cost of a organ in a church. People just don't have the concept on how much a organ costs, and I think they want a pipe organ because it's what they want to have, but they really don't know all the cost and the detail and the customization is involved with it. What type of process you normally would tell them as you go through you really dealing with a real pipe organ versus maybe a digital organ and two different sounds, one is sample, one is actual sound. I kind of walk them through the process. Hey, this is how much this roughly is going to cost you. How do you normally go about that with them?
Yeah, as I said also before, the customers that would look into my organs and getting one, they would already know quite a bit about that sort of thing, what an organ costs. I mean, my organs, they range in size and therefore also in price. So I could say an organ for a smaller church could maybe cost $300,000, and maybe one for a really large church could be $2 to $3 million by the time it's all done. And the reason for the price of these things is the incredible amount of labor that goes into it, because we make really literally all the parts except a few electrical components like the blower and screws and type readily available hardware and stuff we buy, but there's literally hundreds of thousands of parts that we make, and we just plow through this and make it, and being patient, waiting for things to get done. And then, see, we don't really get mixed up with electronic or digital sound, because people that want that or consider that, they would never really even consider one of my organs, and also the other way around. A digital organ can still be very pricey. I have heard prices of hundreds of thousands of dollars for a digital device that might not really, or most likely will not last all that long, because it is a computer-generated sound. So there is basically a computer in there that produces this sound, and as most people know, computers don't really last all that long. So it's obviously they can do a lot of things in imitating sound, but I think in the end it's a short-lived kind of an investment, and maybe not a good one. Therefore.
Okay, but to get in yours is a minimum of $300,000. If they have a big space, is something that can be overcompensated to make the space bigger. For example, you have a lot of sanctuaries that are fitting 1,500, 1,800 because, for example, a Catholic church, they're just building larger churches to accommodate because of less priests in the future. With those type situations, will the person be able to kind of compensate both ways? And maybe they can't. There's no way they're going to swing maybe $3 million out of their congregation, and they're just making income maybe $2 million a year. If there are any other options, if they come to you, they would really want a prime instrument. Maybe they want to do it in pieces and say, hey, what can I do if I get a console and build from here, and I just do it in tranches, if that makes sense?
Well, yeah, we look at an instrument as a piece of a certain aspect of an instrument that we build. We could say it's a piece of art. Mm-hmm. Not everything necessarily, but there's a certain aspect of a finished instrument that one might say that's art. And the concept of an organ, to design it and then to execute the construction of it, it's all interlocked with the idea of something with really high integrity. It's not really all that possible. One thing, though, that is possible is when I'm talking about sizes of organs, many times in Europe, many churches are very large, but they still have much, much smaller instruments than we tend to build here in this country. And because the sound, no matter how large the organ is or small, the sound will be adjusted, the sound level, as far as loudness, will be adjusted to the acoustics that the instrument is going to be placed in. And therefore, and we call that voicing, this voicing process to adjust sound to the room. And therefore, small instruments could be adequate, certainly, for a larger space. And the one problem, of course, is nowadays the church musicians are highly educated people that go all the way with studying and then practicing all kinds of many different styles of organ music, and therefore those people will want as much as they can in order to do all these different sort of things, performances and music styles. So it's a bit of a dilemma in a way. But if there's a strong person behind the project, usually they will find the money. And often when I start negotiating with a new customer, it might take years before it comes to a contract.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked, with committees or with customers for like 3 to 4 years before, from start to finish, not finishing actually building, but actually starting to build or actually signing a contract. And pipe organs have been extremely common in traditional churches mostly. And I know that, of course, the electronic organ made it possible for some people to get by with much less money. But really inexpensive electronic organs are not very satisfying sounding instruments. And once you get into better ones, if that's really possible, then it costs a lot of money too to do that. And then when the customer or committees learn how long these instruments can live and really think about it, then it's really an investment for the future. And a lot of people are like that idea, and then obviously some don't. But it's a big process and a big commitment when a church or a customer decides to really go into this.
Okay.
And there are churches. It's even though you talked about budget within a church being maybe $2 million, and then a $3 million instrument would be a lot. But typically, that kind of the money that needs to be raised for an organ typically comes from certain individuals that will give the money for this sort of thing, but possibly not, and might not have anything to do with the general budget of a church or institution.
Okay. Lastly, questions is regarding maintenance, and mainly maintenance, and also some ways that a church can look at raising funds for an organ, and that's been real successful that you know of.
Mm-hmm. Well, maintenance is something that, of course, it will need, like anything that moves or has moving parts in it, that it will need to be taken care of. But we have come to a point that where it can be kept to a quite a minimum. That it really depends on how you compare things. But we are very interested to keep maintenance very low, because that's not our business, maintaining organs, really building. So our interest is mostly to make it as maintenance-free as possible. So there might be, we teach the local organist or the person or somebody in the church who has some mechanical and musical inclinations, teach people to make minor fixes here and there, adjustments, or to tune the reeds so that once they go out of tune more often. The fluor work, which is the majority of the pipe in an organ, there is no moving parts, and then once they're in tune, they stay in tune with very minor exceptions. But fundraising, you asked about fundraising. Yeah, I typically don't get involved in that. I sometimes, of course, will make a presentation when a church asks me to help out to explain why an organ costs as much as it does, or why they should have such an organ. And then I will come in sometimes and present like a process and explain and answer questions that might arise. But the fundraising itself, I don't really get involved in.
Okay, great. Lastly, what do you like to leave us with regarding your company And at the very end, they'll tell us how can we reach out to you, the website, your phone number, and general information about you. What do you like to leave our audience with?
Yes, well, I do what I do because I'm very passionate about organs, organ sound, and organ literature, the music played on it, and I always have been, and that will never change. But I can be reached. I have a nice website, I think, where a lot of questions are being answered, and lots of pictures and many mechanical or technical details that one can look up. That's at www.pasiorgans.com. That's PASIORGANS.com. And typically we don't get inquiries just like, we don't even have a storefront or anything like that. We're just a shop that's in a former elementary school that had been closed down back then. And but my phone number is 253-843-2914 in case anybody is interested in talking about organs and finding out more.
Great. Thank you so much again. And what's that website address again?
That's www.pasiorgans.com. And Pasi is my last name, Pasi, and then organs with an S, plural.com.
Great. Well, Martin, thank you for joining the program. We're learning a lot about organ building today, and I appreciate all your time and your effort. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Again, this has been another production of the Core Business Show. You can download this episode on iTunes or Blog Talk Radio. Everybody have a great day and take care.
Thank you for listening to the Core Business Show with Tim Jacquet. For a free quote on equipment leasing and financing, visit our website, applecapitalgroup.com. That's applecapitalgroup.com. And fill out the information to receive your free quote. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. And remember, you can always get to the core via iTunes. You'll find all our previous episodes there. Thanks again for listening to the Core Business Show with Tim Jacquet.